By 1945, Europe wasn't just a battlefield. It was a scar that stretched from the Atlantic to the ruins of Stalingrad. Cities were dust, families torn apart, and hope hung by a thread. But amid this devastation, one question remained. How did the most powerful war machine in history collapse so completely, so fast? This is the untold story of how the war in Europe came to its brutal, inevitable end. A story of pride, power, and the final desperate days of a dying empire. By January 1945, the German Reich was surrounded. To the east, Stalin's Red Army thundered toward Berlin, crushing resistance like a wave swallowing the shore. To the west, American and British forces had crossed the Rhine. Germany's defeat was no longer a question, only when it would happen. But inside Hitler's bunker beneath the Chancellery, reality had lost meaning. The once calculated Führer now lived in a fantasy, commanding divisions that no longer existed. He spoke of counteroffensives that were never coming. His generals, once loyal, now whispered of doom. Yet, despite knowing the war was lost, Hitler refused surrender. For him, defeat meant betrayal. He believed if Germany fell, it didn't deserve to exist at all. Transitioning from desperation to delusion, the Nazis launched their final gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. For a moment, it worked. Snowstorms blinded Allied pilots and American lines buckled. But within weeks, the offensive crumbled, taking with it Germany's last reserves of fuel, tanks, and hope. That was the moment historians would later call the beginning of the end. By spring 1945, the Allies stood on Germany's doorstep. But victory wasn't just about ending the war. It was about who would control what came next. Behind the smiles and handshakes, a silent rivalry brewed between the West and the East. Stalin wanted Berlin. To him, it wasn't merely a prize. It was revenge for the 20 million Soviet lives lost. Eisenhower, on the other hand, knew that capturing Berlin would cost tens of thousands more Allied soldiers. So he made a controversial decision: to halt and let the Soviets take the capital. This move reshaped history. The fall of Berlin would become not just the end of Nazi Germany, but the first spark of the Cold War. As Soviet artillery drew closer, Berlin became a city of ghosts. Civilians fled underground, living among the dead. Teenagers were handed rifles, told to defend the Reich. Old men who had survived one world war were forced to fight another. The air was thick with fear and denial. April 16, 1945, the Battle of Berlin began. Soviet forces, numbering over 2 million, launched a full assault. They shelled the city day and night. The ground shook. Buildings collapsed. Streets turned into rivers of rubble and blood. Inside his bunker, Hitler still refused to face the truth. He accused his generals of betrayal, sacked commanders, and demanded impossible victories. Reports show he barely slept, his health failing, his hands shaking constantly. As the Soviets closed in, Hitler's inner circle fractured. Hermann Göring, his once chosen successor, secretly sent a message suggesting he take control. Hitler saw it as treason. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, tried to negotiate surrender with the West. When Hitler discovered this, he exploded in rage, screaming, shaking, collapsing in despair. The empire he built through fear was now dissolving through betrayal. By the end of April, Soviet troops were just blocks from the Reich Chancellery. The city was gone. Every street, every corner was a battleground. The air smelled of gunpowder and smoke. Hitler gathered his remaining followers, his secretary, his generals, and Eva Braun. On April 29, he married Eva in a small, quiet ceremony inside the bunker. The next day, April 30, he dictated his final words, blaming the Jews, condemning his generals, and insisting Germany had failed him. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva retreated to his private room. A single gunshot echoed through the bunker. The man who promised a 1,000-year Reich was gone by his own hand. His body was burned, as ordered, in the Chancellery garden. Outside, the Red Army raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. The war Hitler started in arrogance ended in ashes. With Berlin captured, the last of Germany's defenses collapsed. Hitler's chosen successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, tried to negotiate a limited surrender, hoping to surrender only to the Western Allies and keep fighting the Soviets. But the world had no patience left for half measures. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially signed an unconditional surrender in Reims, France. The next day, May 8th, was declared Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. Across London, Paris, and New York, millions flooded the streets. Soldiers kissed strangers. Tears and laughter filled the air. For the first time in 6 years, the guns fell silent. But victory came with a heavy cost. Over 60 million lives had been lost worldwide. Entire cities lay in ruins. Europe's borders were redrawn, its people scarred, its soul uncertain. The war was over, but peace was fragile. What the world didn't see immediately were the secret deals and dark decisions that followed. The Allies, while celebrating victory, were already dividing spoils and preparing for the next era of conflict. In a covert mission known as Operation Paperclip, American intelligence secretly smuggled hundreds of Nazi scientists and engineers, men who had worked on weapons, rockets, and even human experiments, into the United States. These same minds would later help launch the US space program. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Stalin's armies imposed control through fear and force. The same soldiers who liberated nations soon occupied them. Cities like Warsaw and Prague traded one regime for another. The war in Europe had ended, but a new kind of war, colder, quieter, and far longer, was just beginning. 1945 didn't just mark the end of Nazi Germany. It marked the rebirth of the world. Out of the ashes rose the United Nations, built on a single promise: never again. Nations rebuilt, economies revived, and for the first time in history, humanity truly understood the cost of silence. But as the Allies divided Germany, built new alliances, and tested new weapons, the shadow of war never truly left. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, each suspicious of the other, each racing for dominance. The guns had gone quiet, but the echoes of that silence shaped the next century. The war in Europe ended not with glory, but with exhaustion. Not with triumph, but with lessons written in blood. It showed the world that tyranny can rise in plain sight, that pride can blind even the most powerful, and that peace must always be guarded with vigilance. Empires crumbled, millions perished, and when the smoke cleared, humanity looked at itself and whispered, "Never again." But history has a cruel habit of repeating itself, because the truth is, endings are never truly the end, only the beginning of something new.